So thank you all for joining us today for the town hall share, the trains that built West Chicago. And again, happy St. Patrick's Day. So the area that we call West Chicago now, up here in the northeastern part of Illinois, although many of you probably hear today about the lopsided state in Chicago and the Chicagoland area gets so much attention, actually was one of the last parts of Illinois to be developed. So this is a map from 1822 that at the time shows what was most important in the development of Illinois, which was the rivers, the waterways, the canals that connected them. That was really where most of the business and most of the development was in the early days of Illinois, which was incorporated in 1818. And around that time was when there was a large shift in who was occupying this area. So this is Chief Shabanaw, who was part of the Potawatomi tribe. And these are what they lived in. These are the wigwams that the villages were set up as. And there were many Potawatomi villages throughout this area and other Native American tribes who would move in and out of this area. But as Illinois began to pick up, and then by the 1830s, when we see the Black Hawk War, that's really where we see the biggest shift in development in what's today the Chicagoland area. And the Potawatomi and other tribes are ran out of this area. And we see a large influx of German immigrants. A lot of them live around the area of Klein Creek Farm. Here you can see Anna Klein, who was one of our German immigrants. Her family's farm is still remembered as Klein Creek Farm that the County Forest Preserve runs. And then this picture on the right is of Robert Benjamin, and he was one of the early settlers on the northern part of what is now West Chicago that founded Benjamin School District, which is the longest running school district in the state of Illinois. But you'll see that German was a large part of the community here in West Chicago as well, but there were many German farmers in this area. And then in 1848, Mr. John B. Turner bought a portion of land that would become known as Junction, and he worked for the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, which would become the Chicago Northwestern, and today that we all know of as the Union Pacific. And he bought a plat of land and then sold it to the railroad to make this railroad junction. So the Chicago, Galena, and Union is what came out of Chicago. And then when it got here to Junction, they had a little spur that took people up into St. Charles, but it wasn't long before Aurora decided that they also wanted to have their own branch. And that is the branch that we can see here that heads towards the south, and then we'll loop around and go down to Aurora. And this junction point actually became where different train lines met and was the first community created in 1849 by the western expansion of the railroad. So down here, and sorry, my map's showing up a little pixelated, but you can see Gary's Mill that was operating here. Over here, we have Wheatland, which was a small settlement that now is more part of Winfield actually, but it takes its name also from the lands that would become Wheaton. And then down here you see Warrenville. This is just right at the time that we're starting to get more settlement around this railroad junction. The Pioneer locomotive, which was a very famous steam locomotive, is what left right here from West Chicago and headed off on the Aurora branch in September 2nd of 1850. Sometimes Batavia or Aurora likes to claim that they're the birthplace of the Burlington route. Today we know of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. But it was actually Junction, Little Turner Junction, West Chicago, where the Pioneer locomotive headed down south to Aurora. So it started right here in West Chicago. You can actually now see this Pioneer locomotive. It's at the Chicago History Museum there on the north side of the city. But we're very proud of this little Pioneer and that it really put West Chicago on the map. This is just a wonderful map of the early settlement. So this is that junction that you saw on that large map. And you can really see that that's the core of what would become West Chicago, what was still known as Junction in those days. So many different depots sprung up. We had a freight yard over here where you see what kind of looks like a roundhouse, but wasn't, was actually where the puffer bellies would park overnight, the steam engines that had to stay on to keep them warm. If you know West Washington Street and East Washington Street, this is actually where the gas station used to sit that was just taken down last year. Here you would see there would be many more lines that actually crossed West Washington. Today, many of us get stopped here, over here on the left side of the map at that crossing. Many of us have sat there many times if you're from locally here from West Chicago. And then this route that goes down to the south, again, this is the Burlington and what would head off to Aurora. Today, this line no longer comes to downtown West Chicago. It ends at what used to be General Mills. But you can see how vibrant all of these different train lines coming into what was the heart of the city, of the growing community, would make this really quite a bustling downtown. Here we have our Congregational Church, which used to sit in where the Republic Bank now sits here on the corner, and their drive-through and the parking lot behind the the American Legion sits right here where the original Congregational Church used to be. And then here you see Dr. J.M. McConnell's lands. So Mr. Turner, John Turner, who sold this plot of land to the railroad, he's the one that originally plotted this area, and in honor of this railroad junction, named it Junction. When the McConnells came to town and in 1857 bought this northern area, so if you think of East Washington up through Oakwood, Ingleton, Arbor, that's the area that the McConnells then plotted in honor of Mr. Turner as Turner. So the two plots of land were informally known of as Junction, but we were actually incorporated as the town of Turner, merging the two early plots of land. And here you can see this is the oldest depot here in West Chicago that is still standing. So this is our little red depot that thankfully now looks a lot better. This was the original Burlington Depot. We don't have a firm date on this, but we know that it was constructed in early 1860s. And this picture up here on the upper left-hand side is where it would have stood there on Wood Street. So almost exactly across the tracks from where it is now. This picture on the bottom right hand of your screen, this was when it needed some work, needed some tender loving care, and this was right before it was moved to Main Street, where it was part of the Heritage Commons Park. But now we are very grateful that it has been restored. We're still working to restore more of the inside, but the exterior has been taken care of, and now it's right behind the West Chicago City Museum on Turner Court. It's 134 Turner Court, and the library parking lot is that parking lot that you see right behind it. But this is the oldest existing depot that's still standing, early 1860s. This depot, many of you might know, but now it sits on West Washington. It's at 119 West Washington. This is our 1864 depot. This originally sat where the Fox and Helen Community Center sits now at that bend on Main Street. You can see this was a beautiful depot. A passenger and freight depot, had many open doors, open windows, just a beautiful structure. There is a restoration process that's taking place right now with this depot that is on West Washington Street as well. So we look forward to, in the next few years, seeing this building rehabbed. This building was moved in 1912. The Belding Moving Company, who were skilled movers throughout West Chicago and then grew fame throughout Illinois, they moved this building in 1912 so that the existing community center that was built there in 1912. This building is also a very important building, and you can see the interior of our roundhouse here on the bottom right picture. And then we have this beautiful blueprint that also shows you how many train lines used to operate through downtown West Chicago. This was built in 1864, so right at the tail end of the Civil War. And this was really when so much attention had been drawn to the railroad in Turner Junction that we required to have our own roundhouse. This now is about the location. If you can see some of these street names, you might be familiar with them. This is about where the police station sits on Wilson now. You know, the main street, which runs right here, and the bridge that comes off and over there on Wilson Street. If you were here for Big Boy 2 years ago, which feels like decades ago with all we've been through in the last year, but although this roundhouse no longer stands, you can see some of the sidings that come in off of this main train line, and Big Boy actually pulled right off of one of those sidings. The Union Pacific still has a small rail yard here, which made it possible for Big Boy to pull right in here with the police station sitting in front of it. The roundhouse was a huge operation here in West Chicago and very, very important to development. Here you can see it from a different angle, as well as the water tower that used to exist here in West Chicago. And then here we have some of the steam engines backed in front of the turntable. This was a very important building, but sadly, in the 1950s, as it was in disrepair, it caught fire one day. And as the firemen tell, it was such a sad story because they were having a planned burn that day in a structure on the south side of town. So as all the different fire departments came into town, they could see something was burning, but they thought that they had started the practice burn early, but our poor roundhouse was burning down. And so by the time they realized that it was the roundhouse on fire and got there to put it out, the structure had been destroyed beyond repair. We wish we still had that, since Aurora's Roundhouse is really quite a attraction for downtown and hosts Two Brothers. But this is, we do have quite a bit of photographs from such an important structure. It was also a really big employer, and we hope that you'll join us in April when we discuss some of the employees and other men who worked on the railroad here in Turner Junction. So here's a map. If we think of that earlier hand-drawn map, this is a much larger scale developed map in 1874. This was drawn and made for the DuPage County Atlas that was constructed. Here, down here in the bottom center, you can see our roundhouse, the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad shipyards. You can also see here we have the depot. This is our 1864 Chicago Northwestern depot that's now been moved. This little building that sits right here was the beanery, or one of those early little whistle stop diners that eventually would become Douglas Cafe. There's other structures that are popping up, but you can really see in this map just from 1850 to 1874 how much more development we're getting throughout town. It's really growing up. We're seeing a lot more subdivisions that are being added. And as the railroads are further developing, we're also seeing a lot of homes moved. And this is where the Belding Company that moved that 1864 depot in 1912. This is when Mr. Belding comes to town, and he really makes his name moving houses out of the way of structures. You can see some other names, Mr. Ty, Condi, maybe some names that you're familiar to you, Carey's. So there are still some family farms that are around the outer edges of the community, but the town is really starting to quite grow up at this point. And then in 1888, after much work was done in the preceding years, and in 1887, the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad comes through West Chicago. And this is one of the little signal stops, and two of the men who worked at that signal stop. One of the first structures that the EJ&E put in. You will notice that many of the EJ&E, which is now the Canadian National, many of their structures are wood, as opposed to the Chicago and Northwestern, which were all made of brick, which is an interesting point in how we differentiate how many of the structures are. The signal station is no longer there. Everything's mechanical now, but if you imagine these men going out with their lanterns to wave down the train, to give them their signal, especially because the EJ&E is coming in as a fourth train line at that junction and adding just one more crossing point. So these signal men were very, very important to train traffic. Here we have a photo. Again, we see another wood depot structure of the EJ&E depot. This sat off of Grand Lake. And then we finally get a brick EJ&E structure. This is the JB Tower. This is still standing there at West Washington Street at the train crossing. And this picture also is just so wonderful because you can see the detail of these train lines and the steel actually meeting here. It's a really great image of that structure and the train here passing. So trains were such an important part to the growth of West Chicago, but as people settled here, as the town grew in population, the trains really dictated much of the movement from the north side to the south side, which is a familiar story in many cities. Here, this is actually the EJ&E line heading up towards West Chicago, and you can see some of the structures in downtown. So we have some homes here along this actual route here, the Chicago Northwestern. You can also see what was the old Opera House there on Washington Street. And this street right here is West Washington. So you can see here's the junction point, but it gives you a little bit of an idea as these homes were built then all along West Washington, how different those structures would have been. Here's another map. This is a little bit later. This is an 1898 map. And you'll notice one important thing here, West Chicago. We now have our name changed. So we have gone from Turner Junction to West Chicago in 1896. When the EJ&E came through West Chicago and the fathers that be really looked at our town and said, we love our town of Turner, whose nickname is Turner Junction, but we don't feel very metropolitan. And how can we attract more business now that we have 3 very bustling train lines here in town? How can we attract more industry, more workers, and more people to come and settle to our community? So they decided that we needed a town change, our name town change. So they changed us from Turner to West Chicago, hoping that people would think we were very metropolitan, like the city of Chicago. We still get many, many people who confuse the name and think that we are the west side of Chicago, even though we're about 30 miles west. But that name change was really important for the growth of industry. We see the EJ&E give away right-of-ways along the train for factories to come in, and we really see quite a bit of development. In this map, you will see Depot Street, which has now been renamed to Main Street, and North Street, which is Washington Street. You still see all of these different train lines coming in. This is also one of my favorite maps because you can see this little siding right here that runs on what is now Turner Court. And this was the freight depot lane. So there's a little freight depot right here. But these freight trains would pull right up to the back of all of these buildings. So if you ever drive down Turner Court, you can see that many of our back doors are lifted up a little bit. And that was because of the railroad access. So the freight trains could pull right up and unload. So a store like Norris Furniture, which is right here, which was also the undertaker and the funeral parlor, they could deliver furniture, caskets. It was a very, very easy right of way right here. The museum, which is located in what was Turner Town Hall, West Chicago City Hall, is located right here. And then we see the Ripley Hotel, which many of you might know as the Trails Inn, and then now Gallery 200, which is currently being refurbished. So that building was also very important for the people who were coming to visit town, moving in and out of town, coming to stay and see if they wanted to settle or until they found their own house. So a very important structure in our community's history as well. Congregational Church is still standing up here at this time. And you can see many of the little other things popping up, like down here we have the lumber store, which many of you maybe remember as Ward's Lumber. So that is built by this time. This is now where the library is. And if you think about this line that is running right underneath Turner Court, which no longer exists anymore, but this was how the Puffer Bellies got in to park over on the west side of the train tracks. So as I said, the EJ&E was very important, and they also brought a lot of larger structures. So here we have a side shot of the coal chute, which was really the heart and soul of back in those days when it was steam engines. So a very important structure. Down here, we have another map that just shows further development. And as all of these things get brought in for the train tracks, we need employees. And by 1940s, we estimate that about 40% of the working population of West Chicago worked for the train, which was very, very important. Here's another view of that coal loader, and you can see how the trains could just pull right up and get their load of coal. This one particular was to the west of town. So these are tracks headed north, not very far from where we just had that derailment last month here in West Chicago. And then this is a picture of our puffer bellies, the yard where they would sit just to the west of downtown proper. So this is where that gas station used to be and where we look forward to seeing City Hall, the new City Hall campus built in the next few years. You can see all the steam engines just lined up here, smoking away. Because of the growth of the trains, we also attracted a lot of factories, but also the stockyards. So there was an early stockyard, just a small one, that was in downtown West Chicago, right where you turn off Main Street to head into Turner Court right now. There was a small one, but then a larger one was built up on the west side of town. If anybody knows where the carport is there, where the trains pull up and pick up cars, that used to be Nissan and Saturn. This is actually right where the stockyard was at. And the Chicago and Northwestern Stockyard, which was shifting things out of Chicago as Chicago built up. West Chicago was one of the largest stockyards in the state of Illinois. You can see just the vastness of the barns. But the stockyard also proved very important to the history of West Chicago because it allowed for not just the stockyards to be built up and the cattle and the other livestock to be picked up out here, but on the side of the stockyard and in the surrounding area, there was also native prairie, which was preserved because the stockyards were there. And so when the stockyards actually burnt down and then were gone, our former mayor, Mayor Truitt, and some other people had gone out and discovered these beautiful prairie lands that really stayed pristine because of the stockyard here. So there wasn't built up factories. And now this is the Western DuPage Prairie, which you can go and visit on the west side of town. It's one of the largest native prairies in the whole state of Illinois. And much of the native aspects that were preserved were really because the stockyards were there and nothing else was built up around it. This is one of my favorite shots, just second to the next one that I'm going to show you, but it really shows the vastness of the trains that used to run through downtown West Chicago. As a West Chicagoan, and if any of you on this call have had to pass through town if you don't live here, being stuck at a train, let alone a double train, there's actually a check-in point on Facebook. So if you're stuck at the double train, many of us complain about that, or if you work on one side of the tracks, you will often have to tell your employer, I got stuck at the train, which happens quite a bit. But here you can see the vastness. This picture is from around 1910 of just how vast it used to be. So navigating, walking from the west side or the north side of town, if you went to south side school or vice versa, was quite an endeavor to cross the tracks. You can see all of these wonderful water towers as the steam engines also relied not just on coal, but on water. And here's some of the buildings in the distance here. Some of these might look a little familiar to you. Here is the Opera House on West Washington. This is now an empty lot. Unfortunately, it was torn down. But you can also see the depot here. This was the Chicago Northwestern Depot that would sit just off of Main Street. And then Main Street's running right over on this side, on the right side of your picture. And so this gives you a little bit of better view. You can see Main Street right here on the right side of your photo. Here you can see a little stock pen, what was left from the stockyards that was still in town. But my favorite aspect of this picture is right in the middle of the photo. Perhaps you can see that woman who's dressed in a white gown, her white dress with all these really dirty steam engines. It's just such an amazing thing to think about, having to cross all of these tracks wearing the dress of the period. So quite an interesting view of that. And quite honestly, because of that, West Chicago had many railroad injuries in their collection. We are lucky enough to have a couple of the railroad surgeon and the railroad doctor's logs, which track every time that they were called out for an accident or an injury at the roundhouse, or a worker would get his hand caught in the coupling, and just to look through and see how often those things occurred. It's quite amazing. In our April talk, we'll also talk about a couple of those railroad workers who lost hands, lost legs. And it was actually a very dangerous job. And just looking at this image, you can just imagine how treacherous it could be to have to navigate this as your working landscape. It's pretty amazing to think about. It also brought on, though, that danger of crossing the tracks led to different developments. And this is the tunnel. Some people love the tunnel. Some people have not the best, fondest memories of the tunnel under the tracks. But here we have a happy group of students who are going under the tracks, headed off to community high school. But it shows just how much the community then changed and had to operate, and the landscape was very much shaped by the trains. This is a view of our 1912 Chicago and Northwestern Depot. And so this is a little bit further, this picture is from the 1920s. And this depot building is now the community center right there on Main Street, which still does have the nice overhang, but that's where a lot of the passengers would wait. So when our boys went off to fight in both World War I and World War II, this is where they would have left from the station at the time. This is before Metra, before we had the Metra line, when the Chicago and Northwestern still did have passenger rail. But a really great shot that also shows these wonderful baggage wagons. When we go in and talk to the second graders, we talk about what did it mean to travel in those days. When you didn't have a nice luggage and nice suitcase with wheels on the bottom and you traveled by trunk, it's so important to think about how different it was, not only for what you owned as an individual, but when you would go and travel on the train, what that meant to also pack your luggage. And you can also see here, hopefully you can see my cursor, on the two sides of the train, the two semaphores that also acted as signals in those days. We also had another train line that ran through downtown, right on Main Street, actually, West Chicago, the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin. And many people long for the days of this trolley car because it actually provided some north-south train travel, which otherwise we only had, and still today with the Metro line, only have that east-west travel. You can see that this interurban trolley car, which had a third rail, an electrified rail, headed out from Chicago west into the suburbs. There was a few little split offs, and then right there at Wheaton actually split north to head up to Elgin, headed out west to Geneva, and then also a line that went down to Aurora and Batavia. Here in West Chicago, we actually had three different stations: our High Lake Station and our Prince Crossing Station, and then the main station, which was on Main Street in West Chicago at 102 Main Street. We no longer have the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin. Instead, we have the Illinois Prairie Path. And I apologize, this map is showing up rather pixelated, but maybe from this red line, you can at least see how it really mirrors what used to be this interurban train line, which when it went out of business in 1957, they turned it into a prairie path, which is really a wonderful story of this rails to trails, and that we still use this right away. This is a wonderful image and rather hard to imagine for those of us who live and work in downtown West Chicago, of this interurban coming right down Main Street. So this building here with the tower on the top, this is City Hall, which at that time was still the fire department, which is why we have that little tower on the right side of our building where they used to hang up the hoses. This building here in the foreground, this is the Ripley Hotel, which had all these rooms up top, which is currently, as I said, being renovated. But you can see how these Italianate structures, which would have had that the freight line that ran right to the back of the building on the lower level, which is not visible from this higher level on Main Street, but that basement level exposed on Turner Court now, which was where the freight trains would pull in, and then the interurban trolley car that ran right down Main Street. Although the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin did run until 1957, it left West Chicago by 1937. So we had it for a much shorter period of time than other communities did. And mostly because we had the Chicago Northwestern. So they were really, the two were really competing, which made a big difference. This is a picture of the High Lake Station, and you can actually still see these steps. So High Lake was a country retreat for many people in Chicago who wanted to get out of the bustling, growing city. It was a beautiful lake that has since dried up. But there was one of the interurban stations right there, so you could hop on the trolley and head on out for some relaxing time at a cottage out at High Lake, which is, if you're headed towards CDH from downtown West Chicago, maybe many of you travel along on High Lake Road right there. This is now all a residential area, but as I said, the steps are still there. And of course, where the train line is, there's the Prairie Path, so you can ride your bike out past these steps. And then this is the Prince Crossing Station, which still stands right off of Prince Crossing, just north of Hawthorne. And this was a very important station because it was one of the electric substations. It's still existing. It's in a little bit of disrepair, but there's also a project underway to renovate and perhaps move this building as well. But very important, this line didn't go through downtown West Chicago. This was up towards the north, the line that went up off to Elgin. So also an important entry point for getting through with public transportation with this interurban up towards the north. And then right on the south of where this station is where Campbell Soup Mushroom Farm, also known as Prince Crossing Farm, was from 1947 through 2001. So while this interurban cars ran, that was also an entry point. And then this was also where the county convalescent home was, which is where now Wheaton Academy is. So this was also an important transportation point for those developments. And then here we are back in downtown. So this is the pickle factory, the Reed Murdoch Pickle Factory, later known as Monarch Food, and today we know of as Gelser. So if we look at the local landscape that we still have, many of the remnants of what came to West Chicago because of the railroad still exists and are still part of our community. So it's nice to really connect to those aspects of history that have really shaped much of what is still operating in downtown West Chicago. And Gelser's one of the largest employers here in West Chicago with 600 employees, and how important that is today for our economy, and that we can still thank the railroad for that. When the pickle factory was operating though, and you can maybe see in your image some of these the barrels here that were full of pickles, just a wonderful local aspect that many of the people that we talked to who are now in their 60s or 70s worked at the pickle factory and have amazing stories of coming home every night smelling of pickles, but just a really wonderful local history aspect that still exists today in Gelser. And then we have one other train line that we don't often focus on because it didn't run through downtown proper of West Chicago, but the Chicago Great Western, which was started in the 1880s, and then they really grew into the Chicago and Great Western. Many refer to this as the Corn Belt because it ran through and transported so much of the crops in Illinois and Iowa. This ran through the northern part of West Chicago, which is now part of West Chicago, but at the time was known as Ingleton. And this is the Ingleton Station. So if you think of you're heading up north on Route 59, where you go over the bridge by the Timberlake apartment building, that's, if you looked just to the west when you're on that bridge, that's where you would have seen the Ingleton train station. Ingleton was a small settlement right there, and it had its own school. That building still stands as well, just on the opposite side, on the east side of 59 from where this train station used to be. And this is also part of that aspect of the Prairie Path that runs north through West Chicago and then up to Elgin. I'm going to end the slideshow now and see if anybody has any questions. You're welcome to raise your hand or unmute yourself. But I would thank you all for joining.